I learned about socialism and communism through 16 years of lived experience. And today, I'm going to give it to you straight. In case you haven't noticed, there's this group now in the United States that are labeling themselves the Democratic Socialists of America. Its members own expensive iPhones, they have air conditioning in their homes, and they have food in their refrigerators. Let's debunk some of the myths that these new socialists are selling. If you haven't noticed, there's this group now in the United States that are labeling themselves the Democratic Socialists of America. The whole thing is not new, but just saying the name sounds odd. I find it very hard to believe that you can be both a democratic person and a socialist person at the same time. Now, this group does not resemble what I've known and understood as socialists. Its members own expensive iPhones, they have air conditioning in their homes, they don't have to perform forced labor to repay the government for their education, and they have food in their refrigerators. Can you imagine that? What a socialist. Nevertheless, this group is growing and targeting, let's not call it ignorant, but mentally vulnerable population to join their movement led by people who have never lived or experienced or practiced socialism or communism. So let's get serious here and let's debunk some of the myths that these new socialists are selling. Myth number one, healthcare and education are free. Well, newsflash, nothing is free in this life. They just don't tell you directly how you're paying for it. Let me give you a quick example that addresses both healthcare and education in Cuba. Take doctors, for example. These men and women spend 8 years or more in medical school. Their only employment opportunities are in government-owned hospitals, where many earn the equivalent of, $15 or $20 per month, a salary paid by the government. The same government that charges them $4 or $5 for a bottle of cooking oil. If that weren't bad enough, when the government assigns them to go into what they call international missions, meaning that they are sent to work in another country under the supervision of the Cuban government, that host country pays the Cuban government the full value of their services. The doctors themselves receive only a minimal fraction of that money. That is not free education. That is exploitation. That is modern day slavery. And for those receiving medical care inside the island, what good is a free healthcare system when doctors are making less than $15 a month, when hospitals are crumbling, when there is virtually no domestic pharmaceutical production, medications are unavailable, and during crises like COVID, for example, some hospitals don't even have oxygen to provide to their patients. If that's the kind of education and healthcare you want, then by all means, yes, I suppose you can call it free. Myth number two, rent control is the solution. Rent control is often presented as the solution to the rising costs of housing, and it's understandable why people support it. Rent is expensive, families are struggling, and people are looking for relief. But the question we have to ask ourselves is whether rent control actually solves the problem or creates new ones. When the government takes control over how much a property owner can charge for a service or how they can manage their own property, it gives the government a greater authority over private decisions and economic activity. We have seen the consequences of excessive government control in places like Cuba, where the government claims to guarantee housing rights, but where property ownership comes with significant restrictions. For example, for citizens there, when they leave the country for extended periods of time, they come to face the risk of losing their homes under government rules. Imagine a system where the government has enough power to determine whether you can keep your property, even if it's paid for, the one that you've worked your whole life to own. Supporters may argue that rent control simply is about providing relief, but history shows that expanding government control over markets can lead to broader restrictions on individual freedom and economic opportunity. Once the government authority expands into areas traditionally managed by individuals and businesses, that power is often very difficult to reverse. That does not mean you should ignore the challenges that people are facing with housing costs. That's not what we're saying. We absolutely need solutions for housing and to make them more affordable. But the answer should not be give the government free rein and control over people's property and choices. The goal should be creating more opportunity, more things that are affordable, while protecting the freedoms of individuals and what they've built. Myth number 3, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and other European countries practice democratic socialism. Not quite. This is one of the things that bothers me about this new wave of self-proclaimed democratic socialists emerging here in the US. They make a broad and often inaccurate claim, and then people never bother to verify it, and it creates confusion in the process. Traditionally, socialism refers to an economic system in which the state owns and controls much of the means of the production. And I'm being very generous here, let's just be honest. A more accurate way to describe those European countries is to say that they have capitalist economies with varying levels of social welfare. But when an organization like DSA defends the Cuban Revolution, even under a government that has been widely criticized for repressing political dissent and committing serious human rights abuses, it becomes difficult to argue that you're simply advocating for Scandinavian-style welfare policies. It is all a facade, so do not believe it. Do not believe it. You cannot point to capitalist countries with a specific social program while simultaneously defending governments that operate under very different political and economic systems. A country that maintains a capitalist economy is not, in the traditional sense, a socialist economy or a socialist country. Myth number 4, equality is the best way. This is probably one of the biggest misconceptions out there. No one, and I mean no one, is born exactly the same. And therefore, that means that people will always be different in every society. The other day I watched this young girl on Instagram make an excellent point. She said that it was a mistake to make equality the norm because in reality, human diversity is the norm. She used the example of an orchestra. She said, imagine an orchestra where every musician played exactly the same instrument. No beautiful music would come from it. I was genuinely encouraged to hear someone from the next generation articulate that idea so clearly. Now, apply that to what we're talking about here. Socialists often sell the promise of equality by pointing to unequal levels of wealth. But I believe the goal should be to lift the poor up, not to bring the wealthy down. They have it backwards. History has shown that when the government controls the economy, it also gains control over jobs, businesses, opportunities, and people's ability to make independent choices. In places like Cuba, everyone certainly does not live equally. Not everyone shops in the same stores. For those who don't know, not everyone receives the same treatment. The existence alone of the ration book, which was present for many decades and literally dictated how much bread, rice, beans a family could receive, is an example of government control over everyday life. And I'm not even going into specifics of all the failed tactics that socialism uses. We will be here forever. But there are hospitals and facilities reserved for political elites. For years in Cuba, and obviously I'm using Cuba as an example because that's where I lived, and actually because it is one of the most enduring socialist communist experiments that has ever existed, ordinary Cubans were prohibited from entering many of the country's hotels and tourist facilities, including places like the Marina Hemingway, while foreign visitors enjoy the privileges denied to Cuban citizens. And I'm pretty sure it's still happening at some capacity today. Imagine placing foreigners ahead of your own people simply because they bring in hard currency. And with the Cuban government, it is always and will always be about the Benjamins. The same currency that government tells people comes from evil capitalists. Now that is not equality. That is hypocrisy. Myth number 5, people live happier in socialist nations. This is a rich one. I don't see many people moving from capitalist nations to socialist nations. I do see many people leaving those systems and coming here. And obviously, as we said previously, those European countries are not really socialist if they have a capitalist economy. But anyhow, history often romanticizes socialism because, it misrepresents the facts all the time. Ask almost anyone who has ever lived under economically failing socialist system. This story is, it tells us all as time. For instance, people who admire, the romance of it, the vintage cars in Cuba. Oh, well, let me tell you, there's a huge difference between restoring an old classic automobile as a hobby and keeping a 70-year-old car because you have no alternative other than to repair it. And I assure you, Cubans do not find that romantic at all right? There is a huge difference between saying healthcare is free and watching children die because hospitals lack medicine, while the government blames an embargo that was a consequence of their own political actions. There is a huge difference between saying the government wants to help you and realizing the government actually wants to control you. There is a huge difference too between saying we are a sovereign nation with a one-party system and saying if you disagree with us, we'll put you in prison. And they do it. Capitalism and earning money may not sound romantic in socialist, like socialist slogans do, but I assure you, there's far more dignity and far more freedom in building your own future than in depending entirely on the state. And I'll leave you with this. Don't allow attractive slogans to replace historical evidence. Judge ideas by their real-world results, not by their promises. Because when the government decides what you can say, what you can access, what opportunities you can have, what information you can receive, well, it's very simple. That's when freedom begins to disappear. I am still old enough to remember what it is like to struggle through blackouts, okay? I remember what it feels like when the government takes away your milk after you're 7 years old. I remember seeing political cartoons and watching political cartoons because there was nothing else to watch until Sunday mornings that it wasn't political. As a child, I remember having to study Marxism in school as if that was a normal education and not indoctrination. I remember being forced to participate in marches such as the Elian Gonzalez marches because otherwise I would fail my academic year. I remember having to study at a rural school if I wanted to attend university and having to perform agricultural labor as a contribution to the revolution. And this is why conversations about socialism are deeply personal for me and for many immigrants that have experienced it. Because some of us did not leave our countries, in search of the same version of that garbage someplace else. So be vigilant about this, be wise about it. That is the Jali word.